Hello Palians! This is the special video I have promised for reaching 100 subscribers. Thank you all for your support. I hope to do a similar video after every other 100 subscribers. So today I am sitting here besides my cute little Kitsu as close as I can so he won't run away, because I will be reading the story The Kitsu and the Moon. So this book is found in Jina's library temple. Once you reach level 3 friendship with her, you can open up the door and get inside. So if you consider this to be a spoiler and you want to read the book on your own, I suggest muting the video maybe. But if you don't think this is a spoiler, or maybe you are the type that doesn't read books in games, then really enjoy this cute story and the art I have prepared for you all. Here's the book, The Kitsu and the Moon. Once upon a time, when only grand ignus hung in the sky, there lived deep in a quiet forest a small Kitsu. Like all Kitsus, she loved shiny things, and so one midsummer evening, as she tracked a shimmer fly in the air with her eyes, her gaze lifted up to the skies where she caught sight of the moon. "Oh my, how bright, how beautiful!" she exclaimed, to no one in particular. Her eyes sparkled in the moonlight as she contemplated how to collect a piece of Ignis for herself. She scampered through the forest until she found the tallest tree, scrambling past the startled Mujin as she climbed and climbed and climbed. As she reached the top, she saw that the forest she had thought her spacious home was just a small patch of trees in a much larger landscape. As she looked up hopefully at the moon with her ears perked up, she realized it seemed just as far as it had when she had been on the ground. The tips of her ears dropped just a little, but as she dropped her gaze from the sky, she saw a cliff off in the distance, taller than the tree on which she perched. And so off she went, scampering down the tree and over toward the cliff in the distance. As she got closer and closer, she realized just how big a task she had ahead of her. The cliff rose higher and higher until at last she was at its base, looking up at an incline that seemed to reach all the way to the very same moon she wanted to catch. The Kitsu puffed up her chest and started on her climb. Onward and onward she ran. Upward and upward she climbed, and yet further and further the moon seemed to be. As she got close to the edge of the cliff, the Kitsu flopped down in exhaustion and bewilderment, for she was no closer to the moon than she was a cliff height ago. Drained of all her energy, the Kitsu slept for a while, and when she woke from her well-earned rest, it was light out, and the moon, while still beautiful, was not the only light illuminating the landscape. And there was so much to see, the little Kitsu had not realized how vast the world was and how much there was in it. As she scurried along the cliffside, the mossy side she had climbed gave way to a darker, sharper edge. She slowed to a careful crawl, and peering over the edge, she saw that the cliff here ended by plunging into a soft bed of sand, punctuated by the occasional rock formations. Every so often, one of the formations burst forth with a geyser shooting into the sky, and as she watched one erupt, she realized that she was looking up at the top of it. Gasping in delight, she took a deep breath, puffing out her chest once more. She wailed for the geyser to drop below her. Before she could change her mind, she gathered up all her tiny courage and flung herself over the edge as the geyser erupted once again. As the Kitsu was launched into the air, she had a moment of vertigo as she flipped and flopped head over tail, tail over head, with a splash of sideways. Almost overwhelmed by the dizziness, she channeled her inner silverwing and spread her limbs taut so her thick fur could stretch out and catch the air. Letting her gently hover above the peak of the geyser. Up and down and up again she bobbed as she looked around in a bubbling excitement that quickly fizzled as the novelty wore off. She was high, higher than she'd ever been before, but the moon looked no closer than it had on the cliff or on the tree. She was closer to an expansive body of water she had never even seen before than the moon she had been admiring this whole time. The ocean glistened all over as it undulated in the wind, so vast she couldn't see it in its entirety, and while she had to admit that it was beautiful, her heart was still set on the moon, and it still seemed impossibly far. In fact, it was hard to keep her beloved moon in sight as she bobbled up and down, up and down. She couldn't stay up here forever. As relaxing as it was, she was still stretched taut. As she contemplated her next move, she saw a mountain whose peak disappeared into the clouds. Surely that was where she would be able to meet the moon. So she pondered and plotted, and the next time the geyser shot her into the air, she aimed herself at the mountain, stretching her paws as far as they would go, and then stretched just a bit further than that, and glided as best as she could towards the nearest geyser. And so she made her way geyser to geyser, shooting up, sailing through the air bit by bit towards the mountain off in the distance. Eventually she found herself landing amongst the trees growing from the base of the mountain. Puffing up her chest one last time, the fur on her chest rippling with energy, she began to climb once more. She scampered across the ground, she scurried up trees, she climbed small cliffs, she glided through the air, until one day as the sun was setting, she broke through the last of the trees and found nothing else above her. As the last of the wash of pinks and oranges faded from the sky and the moon brightened above her, she knew she had made it. She had reached the top. Her ears twitched as she looked up triumphantly to greet the moon, and yet it was just as far as it was before: the mountain, the geyser, the cliff, the tree. It looked the same as when she had first laid eyes on it. She looked around desperately for something, somewhere, even higher than where she was now, but there was nothing to be found. There was nowhere higher she could explore. The Kitsu deflated in defeat. Crestfallen, she returned home to her forest, her head hanging low, ears dropping heavily, tail dragging in the moss. Night after day after night, she aimlessly wandered around and around and around until one night when she stumbled into a small clearing. Startled, she looked up and saw the moon as distant as ever. In despair, she collapsed into a puddle of fur on the ground and began to cry. She begged for someone, for anyone, to help her reach the moon. "I have climbed the tallest tree," she explained. "I have scaled the tallest cliff," she shouted. "I have ridden the tallest geyser," she wailed. "I have conquered the tallest mountain," she howled. "I just want to be friends," she whimpered, exhausted. She rested her weary head on her paws and let her tears form tiny rivers down her face, across her toes, and into the ground, where they began to form a pool. Her pleas echoed for a while, eventually reaching the tree ancients. The phoenix, preoccupied with saving her noisy, wayward people, did not hear her appeals. The chimera, his far and quiet solitude broken, turned to a face away from the chittering noise and watched instead the technological marvels his inventive and clever people had begun to develop. But the dragon, still in its youth and without its own people, could remember what it was like to yearn, and its own nebulous yearning had brought it into being not so many years ago. But that is another story for another day. And so the dragon took pity on the poor Kitsu, gathered the dust of the stars, shaping a small humble moon in its claws, carefully balancing in the sky above the pool that had formed from her tears. And as the pool grew larger enough that the Kitsu's paws were dipped in it, her tears began to tinkle as they fell directly into the water. Startled by the sound, the Kitsu looked up, and lo and behold, she saw the reflection of Luna shining back at her. "Why, hello!" she exclaimed happily, circling the edge of the pool around and around while the moon stayed centered and full, beaming back at her in delight. The dragon spoke then, its voice a deep rumble that she could feel through all of her fur and whiskers. "Your new companion," it explained, "will wander just as you have wandered, but will always return just as you have returned. You are no longer alone." And as it watched the Kitsu settle down into a happy, peaceful slumber lit by the two moons, it began to contemplate its own loneliness. But alas, that is yet another story for yet another day.